Anyway, before we move on to the ontogenesis, let's try to recollect the main terms and definitions so that we clearly understand what nosology units we're talking about. Because oftentimes people confuse ovums with oocytes, with follicles, and oftentimes people confuse follicles at different stages of development with the ovum and so on and so forth. Let's start with the oocyte or ovum. Do not confuse it with the ovarian follicle. And oocyte is not the same as oocyst. The primordial follicle is a misnomer because an oocyte cannot be called a primordial follicle because there are connecting tissues, epithelial. This is what the primordial follicle is all about, while the ovum itself is not part of the follicle. So it's a misnomer, though oftentimes I hear people use it and I see it in literature as well. Unfortunately, like I said, people tend to confuse the primordial follicle, although they actually mean an ovum. Oocyte, right? Immature ovum is called oogonia, and then they develop into oocytes that are not subjected to division. And at the first stage of meiosis, when the old chicks are given birth to, this is when we see the haploid set. After the ovulation, meiosis, it can be said to be over. Anyway, the ovum, which is the yellow part of this diagram, includes a blaster disc, which is has not been fertilized yet. After fertilization, it starts dividing, and there are 60,000 cells. That's blastoderma, which means that the ovum has been fertilized. The next unit is the egg follicle or oocyte surrounded by epithelium and the connective tissue. This is what I call the ovum follicle or egg follicle. There is the vessel pattern, epithelial tissue that ensures synthesis of various sex hormones, and it also ensures the transport of nutrients into the ovum. And the second one is actually the egg, which includes the oocyte, but not the egg follicle because it disappears. It ovulates, which means that the membrane bursts and the ovum gets into the oviduct, and that's when the egg starts to be shaped. Therefore, the follicle disappears after the ovulation stage. Now, let's deep dive into the reproductive system of male chicks. So that you better understand what I'm talking about. This is a histology diagram. This is connective tissue shown here. And inside it, you will see the so-called Leydig cells that synthesize hormones. For instance, for female chicks, we're talking about connective epithelial tissue and theca cells we will be discussing later on. Here, we're talking about the Leydig cells. And behind them, as you can see, there is connective tissue that supports the so-called Sertoli cells. They have various branches that ensure the supportive function for the future sperm cells. They also provide nutrients and serve as immune cells. When the sperm cells develop into spermatogonia, they evolve into sperm stage 1 and so on and so forth, and they remain in the cavity. So in a nutshell, this is what we should be talking when we use various nosology units. Now let's move on to the ontogenesis. The reproductive system development starts at the embryo development stage. However, there is one thing that I should point out. Any poultry behavior depends on the neural and neurohumoral status of the parental flock. About 6 months ago, there was a question from one of the poultry farms, and it was as follows. They have boiler flocks, and some of them are calm, while others start fighting and biting each other at early age. One of the reasons might be the hormonal status of the entire flock. And there are scientific publications proving that when stress hormones were administered to the poultry, it changed the day-old chick's behavior, and such chicks were prone to cannibalism. They were quite aggressive to both the other chicks and the managers. In other words, the hormonal status of the parental flock has a direct impact on the hormonal status of the chicks. And the same holds true for the maternal sex hormones. The higher the sex hormone level in the parent flock, the higher it's going to be in the embryo, because the HPA axis is not shaped over time. It starts to be shaped on day 3 and 4, but it also depends on the level of the hormonal level of the parental flock. Another important thing I want to touch upon, by the way, this slide refers to the national trials devoted to morphology of the poultry. If the entire ontogenesis used as a period, the first postnatal adaptation period, in other words, when the chick is hatched, he or she needs to adapt to new types of feeding, new types of breathing, similar to a human child. This is the most severe stage of adaptation. So at this point, female chicks not only agonia or evolving into oocytes, and we're talking about 3,000 to 4,000 oocytes in day-old chicks. And around oocytes, the epithelial tissue is being developed. It's flat, it's granular, it's flat, but it is still being developed. In other words, this is the development of the so-called primordial egg follicle, and otherwise this ovum will undergo apoptosis and will never grow and develop. Therefore, this stage is of utmost importance. The primordial follicle, as we call them, and the impact of the parental flock hormonal status, the weight of the day-old chick increases over 11 times. I'm talking about ovaries. The ovaries weight increases more than 11 times. And if there is a deficit of feed or water, such flocks will never reach their productivity peak because of the lost time. You will never be able to catch up with that. And the same holds true for male chicks. The testes weight increases tenfold during day 1 after hatching. Everyone seems to understand that, but unfortunately, in real life, no one. So, like I said, in real life, what we see is images like that. Unfortunately, this is a real photo taken on a real poultry farm. That's broiler pullet, and the live weight deficiency was 10 to 20% because the trace minerals intake was too low. I'm not going to go into details. For some reason, I seem to be unable to advance my slides. Anyway, the live weight was lagging behind the reference parameters, and this is the autopsy of a 14-day-old chick. And take a look at the difference of the cardiovascular system. This is the same flock, by the way. The duodenum differences, take a look at that. And of course, the birds were treated for 3 weeks. They looked fine, the feathering was good, and the height was almost normal. But take a look at the the internal organs. Even the masculinity index was 2.5 to 3, but the intestinal length and organ development were insufficient. And this flock lost 5% of its productivity at its peak. And the delay was 3 to 4 weeks. So therefore, the postnatal adaptation mistakes cannot be compensated by any changes in the feed or water intake regimen, and so on and so forth. So this is the very first stage I just described. Day 1 after hatching involves an impact of the high hormonal status of the parental flock, and it paves the way for further productivity. There will be a great presentation on infectious bronchitis, and please pay attention to that, because if a layer is infected at day 1, then the follicles will be affected, and that ultimately undermines your productivity. The high level of hormones has a feedback on HPA axis, and the receptor expression is low, which means that the reproductive organs are not receptive to HPA hormones, and that causes the so-called sexual infantilism. That's even before reaching the maturity and the puberty. And that does not mean that the flock will not mature. It will, but at a very slow rate. This is a very important stage. We don't see such a huge impact of the sexual hormones at this stage. We're talking about the AMH, FSH impact, neuropeptides in the brain. I'm not going to go into details right now, but the morphological growth of the reproductive system is heavily affected. But during the sexual infantilism period, what we see is a greater accumulation of lipoproteins in the ovum, further differentiation of the epithelial tissue. First, we see granular cells that evolve into cubic shape cells, then into plasma shapes, and so on and so forth. But broilers enter the so-called limited growth stage, when we have a limited lighting, a limited feed intake. But as soon as we see pathologies like that, wouldn't you say that it will have an impact on the reproductive system, because it grows all the time? In other words, we see impact at the level of the so-called white follicles, and of course it impacts the testis follicles and ovarian follicles. Nikolai and I discussed the following headache for all of us. All of us are economists, and we all prefer high poultry density for both layers and for broilers. We believe that the higher the density, the higher the profitability, but very few people tend to understand. And it's great that the Novosibirsk Agro-Industry University offers a course in animal psychology. This is great because, it's true for both humans and poultry. If the population density is too high, if the poultry density is too high, then glucocorticoids are released into the bloodstream. That means the stress hormone slows down the reproductive system development. And the white follicles have to develop for several months. If you lose time at this stage, they will never grow back within a week. And you will have to provide the very same period of several months for the follicles to develop properly.
Никак я не приноровлюсь к этой системе. Вот. Это что касается...
That's as far as the sexual infantilism period is concerned. In other words, the body has already developed. So the intestinal system, the cardiovascular system, the connecting tissue is there. The skeletal development is almost over because that's week 5, and the skeletal system has been developed by at least 95%. In other words, there is every prerequisite for reproduction, like gut, cardiovascular systems, and now it's high time to launch the reproductive system development. And this is when chicks enter the pre-puberty period. In other words, the stage 1 of the sexual maturity. And this is exactly what we mean by the pre-puberty. Broilers, broiler stains, depending on the stain, of course, this stage might last for 8 to 12 weeks, and the layers enter this stage earlier at weeks 6 to 8. However, at this stage, the body really realizes, the brain realizes that it's high time to start developing the reproductive system because every other systems are already in place. The hypothalamus releases GnRH, gonadotrophin-releasing hormones that impact the pituitary, and that it starts synthesizing LH and FSH. And now let's talk about the receptor expression. Follicle receptors are sensitive to these hormones, and that starts an entire cascade of the neurohumoral changes. It's such a severe mechanism that the first thing it changes is the sexual behavior of chicks. You will not see the secondary sex characters, but the behavioral changes will be obvious. And flock managers, as well as attentive vets, clearly see birds in heat. Chicks start licking each other, and this is not aggression. This is the pre-reproduction period. Depending on the strain, there will be different ways for behavior changes. But like I said, it's an additional stress for people, and poultry might aggressively react because of the high stress. For instance, they might be aggressive towards flock managers when they enter the hen house, and so on and so forth. In other words, it's a high stress period for the poultry. They might respond in a poorer way.
Чтобы было совсем ясное понимание, у кого есть дети,
and for you to better understand what happens, try to recall what teenagers do during puberty. They wouldn't listen to their parents, and the same holds true for the poultry. Now let's talk about what happens at the level of morphology, testes and ovaries. The FSH and LH hormones influence the testes and the ovaries. For instance, the FSH stimulates the accumulation of lipoproteins, which are whitish in this image. And that's why you see such granulosity here. It's no longer smooth, it's granular.
Well,
in simple terms, this is the stage of small whitish follicles sized less than 1 millimeter. And the testes respond in a very similar way. You might recall that the weight was 0.2 grams. Now the testes weight increases because of the impact of the hormones synthesized by the HPA axis. Now let's move on. Let's move on to the next stage. That's the stage that causes the most headache for the farm managers. When FSH stimulates hormone synthesis, while LH stimulates synthesis of steroids and sexual hormones. And that's when the secondary sex characters become obvious. For instance, cum in male chicks, accumulation of the fat tissue, and so on and so forth. However, the problem is as follows. This is an image from one of the poultry farms, and take a look at the muscular indices difference. It's probably 4, but should be 3. In other words, the weight is the same, but the level of development is totally different. And humans have 5 sensor organs, and the same holds true for birds, which means that farm managers and zoo techniques should focus on the behavior rather than certain parameters. Live weight can be achieved, but you will not be able to rectify any lags and deficiencies in the maturity and sexual development. For instance, feathering started deteriorating in these birds, which means that they were amino acid deficient. And, that means that the ovarian follicles and at this period, we start the egg yolk we start seeing the egg yolk forming, and we're talking about 2 to 5 millimeters. That's the stage of large white follicles development, and the body spends 1 to 2 months to properly develop them. If you see white follicles like that, and when they reach 45 millimeters, that's when we start the fat that's when we start seeing fat being accumulated. That's the follicle development stage at the end of the first stage of sexual development. And these are images from the same flock. Their live weight is the same, but their development, reproductive system development levels were totally different. And some of them will start laying eggs at week 23, while others will delay egg laying until week 26 because their reproductive systems are at different development levels. And this is clear even given the primary sexual characters. And sometimes for poultry farm managers start delaying totally blindfolded. Just a couple of examples. This is a German recipe. Column 2 is the pre-laying feed. You have to provide enough nutrients for the poultry. That's why the pre-laying feed appeared. This is the so-called advanced feed, so that they store enough nutrients for the follow-up reproduction stage. And my question for the Q&A is as follows. What do you think about using enzymes in a feed? And when the nutrient content goes down, just think about that. We'll discuss it during the Q&A. The second question is also quite provocative because the level of calcium in the pre-laying feed might be different. Some say that the level should be 1.2. Some say that calcium should be elevated. Some people say that it should be 1.5. Again, think about it and tell me what your opinion is during the Q&A. And at this stage, the body itself ensures the digestibility because the sex hormones increase the feed conversion ratio. And let me share with you 2 more practical examples. No one loves these examples, but this is a US farm and this is a Russian farm. The flock is of the same age, and this is the way the US chicks looked like, and this is the way Russian chicks. I mean, this strain was a foreign one, but they were raised at at the Russian form. So the feathering seems to be affected on the backs of the birds. When we started looking into this issue, we were totally confused. What was the reason for such a delay? The feed was the same, and we asked our Spanish counterparts to share with us the composition of their feed premix. Sometimes they use corn for producing alcohol, and they use the corn meals as a good source of energy. So take a look. They use corn, wheat, barley, soybean meals in their premixes, and so on and so forth. In other words, the composition was excellent. Now, so once again, let me reiterate. Pre-puberty means changes in the brain, and we're talking about synthesis of steroid hormones by the reproductive system organs. And the steroid hormones or sex hormones ensure morphological changes in the birds, and they also ensure further growth of the reproductive system. That's the end of the puberty stage. It is followed by the reproductive stage. And this is the end of the maturation process. That's when you really understand that the bird is fertile, and you can use lighting impulse to stimulate the HPA axis even more, so that the HPA axis stimulates further development of the reproductive system. And that's why we see an active growth of testes at this stage. And let me reiterate once again, I don't want you to be confused. A primordial follicle is really small in day-old chicks. It evolves into small white follicles sized 1 to 2 millimeters. And the body has to spend at least 2 months on that stage. Yellow follicles sized 8 millimeters need several weeks. And at this stage, the body decides whether to use this follicle in the hierarchy or not. What do I mean by using it in the hierarchy? The follicle enters the fast growth stage, and when it reaches 10 to 12 millimeters or 1 centimeter, the remaining time to ovulation is 7 to 10 days. As soon as you see the follicle of this size, that means that the first egg will be laid in 7 to 10 days. And if the ovulatory follicle is there, then the female chick will start laying eggs. This is the image illustrating various stages. As you can see, there are small white follicles, the corpus luteum, and the luteinization stage. What is the difference between the layers and the broilers? Let me say a few words about that. I actually thought that the more pre-ovulatory follicles we have, well, actually, there's just one of them. So I thought that the more follicles like that we have, the more productive a chick is. But it turns out that it's not the case. This is an image of a layer, and this is an image of a broiler. Well, Mr. Stale, Dr. Stale, proved that the maximum transportation of nutrients from liver to the corpus luteum happens when it's sized to 2 centimeters. So the more follicles like this you see, the lower the productivity. And just a few examples, if I may, so that you see the difference between the layers and the broilers. And that means that the entire layer genetics are aimed at reducing the yolk and increasing the albumin. So the yolk weight goes down while the albumin weight goes up, because that ensures fast development of an egg. Though layers are also being selected for ensuring a higher yolk weight, but for the broilers, the ratio is totally different, because for day-old chicks, small yolk weight is not a proper way to go. So please keep in mind that this is not the best option, because it affects the productivity and the laying rates. And just a few sad stories when the lights went down, and of course it impacted the development. It can only slow down rather than stop altogether the laying process. You cannot stop the laying process. And in conclusion, I just wanted to mention once again that the reproductive system cannot be restored ever again, and every mistake at every stage will have an impact on the poultry productivity. Unfortunately, there were cases when the pullet was way behind in development, and they started laying first eggs at week 30, or even at a greater age. So the month for developing small white follicles had to be found somewhere, and these are the pathologies, of course, that I wanted to demonstrate to you. When the vessel pattern starts developing at the luteinizing stage, the degeneration primarily affects, if bacteria and viruses are transported by the bloodstream, the largest follicles are affected, because they have the best developed vessel pattern. At the pre-puberty stage, the vessels start to be developed, and that's exactly what we start seeing. All right. This is the last slide of my presentation. Just one more photo, actually two photos of two different flocks of the same age, 52 and 54 weeks of age. So it just clearly shows that there could be a huge difference in terms of flock development. The live weight might be the same, but the behavior and the stage of the reproductive system development might be totally different. That was just a brief overview. It was a starting point devoted to morphology and physiology of reproductive system development. And I hope you wrote down questions for the Q&A. I really suggest we discuss them during the Q&A, and I believe it will be more interesting for you to listen to other presenters, because now you better understand what factors affect the reproductive system development at different stages and what the consequences might be. And now let me thank our official sponsor once again, represented by the gentleman here. This is an international company, which is the 5th largest producer in the world. And the main work streams include studies, development, and the production of vaccine, veterinary medicines, drugs, and various solutions for the livestock industry. It also provides training, support, and provides specific services to optimize the use of their products. Thank you so much.